What if I told you the greatest captain in football history was this close to never wearing the armband? That the man who scored the most iconic World Cup goal ever, the one that still played in slow motion like it's the football version of The Godfather, was almost left at home for the 1970 tournament? And that Carlos Alberto Torres, the cold-blooded leader who turned Brazil's golden generation into an unstoppable force, spent years being told he was too reckless, too arrogant, too everything, until he made every single doubter eat their words in the most brutal way possible? This isn't just a football story. This is a revenge saga disguised as a highlight reel. Now, let's be real. Most of us fold under way less pressure. I once had a full existential crisis because my coffee order was wrong. Who am I if not a medium oat milk latte? Meanwhile, Carlos Alberto? This guy treated pressure like it was his favorite playlist. While we're out here panic Googling how to adult, he was out there reinventing what it meant to be a captain, a leader, a winner. But here's the twist. His story almost didn't happen. Because before the glory, before the legend, there was a moment, a single make-or-break moment, where Carlos Alberto stood at the edge of his career, staring down the two paths every underdog faces: fade away, or burn it all down and rise from the ashes. And the crazy part, the fire that almost ended him was the same one that made him. So buckle up, because by the time we're done, you'll know exactly why Pele called him the only man who could have led us to glory. Why that 1970 goal is still studied like the Da Vinci Code of football, and why his enemies still wake up in cold sweats remembering his name. Oh, and that betrayal I mentioned. It wasn't just some petty locker room drama. It was the kind of backstab that would have broken most men. But for Carlos Alberto, it was just fuel. So, if you're ready for a story with more twists than a Netflix thriller, where egos clash, revenge is served ice cold, and one man's stubbornness literally changed football forever, hit that subscribe button right now. Because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens when a guy who was told you'll never be enough decides to become everything. Picture this: Rio de Janeiro, 1950s. A scrawny kid with fire in his eyes and a temper shorter than a free-kick wall is tearing up the dusty pitches of the favelas. This isn't just young Carlos Alberto Torres. This is a boy who played every match like the world owed him something. And honestly, it kinda did. See, football wasn't just a game for Carlos. It was survival. While other kids worried about homework, he was dodging actual bullies who mocked his lanky frame. Coaches called him too aggressive. Scouts whispered he'd never be disciplined enough. Even his own teammates sometimes froze him out because he played with this terrifying intensity, like every match was personal. But here's what they didn't get: that anger wasn't just hot-headedness, it was fuel. At 15, he got cut from Fluminense's youth team for being uncoachable. Most kids would quit. Carlos? He trained alone for months, showing up uninvited to their practices just to stare down the coach who rejected him. By 16, he was back, and this time they couldn't ignore him. The turning point came during a youth tournament that was supposed to be just another game. Carlos played like a man possessed, tackling harder, running faster, demanding the ball like he was already captain. When the final whistle blew, even the opposing coach had to admit, that kid doesn't just want to win, he needs to. But the real kicker? His signature move wasn't some fancy skill, it was his glare. Teammates would later say you could feel Carlos's stare from across the pitch, this unshakable, "we're not losing today" intensity that somehow made everyone around him play better. It wasn't just talent, it was sheer, terrifying willpower packed into a teenager's body. Yet, for all his brilliance, the establishment still saw him as a loose cannon. Coaches benched him for being too much. Older players resented his confidence, and that chip on his shoulder? It was growing into a full-blown boulder. Little did they know, they were creating a monster. Because Carlos Alberto wasn't just getting better at football, he was studying the game like a general preparing for war. Every slight, every doubt, every time someone said, "You'll never make it," he filed it away. And soon he'd make them all eat their words in the most spectacular way possible. But before he could conquer the world, first he had to survive the most cutthroat football environment on earth, Botafogo's dressing room in the 1960s. Welcome to Botafogo in the 1960s, where the football was beautiful and the locker rooms were absolutely savage. Imagine walking into a dressing room with legends like Garrincha, the drunk genius who danced past defenders like they were traffic cones, and Jairzinho, who played like a human hurricane. Now, picture 18-year-old Carlos Alberto strolling in like he owned the place. The veterans hated him. Here's this kid, barely old enough to shave, bossing around players who'd won World Cups. He didn't just want the ball, he demanded it. And if you messed up, oh, you'd hear about it. Teammates called him "O Capitão" as a joke until it wasn't funny anymore. One training session, things boiled over. An older player, let's call him Mr. Fragile Ego, took a cheap shot at Carlos in a drill. Bad move. Carlos didn't just retaliate. He hunted the guy for the rest of practice, crunching into tackles so hard the coaches had to pull him off. Afterward, the manager dragged him into the office, expecting apologies. Carlos just said, "If he can't handle me, how's he going to handle Pele?" Silence. That moment changed everything. Because here's the truth. Botafogo needed that fire. They were a team of artists, but Carlos, he was the hammer. While Garrincha was dribbling for fun, Carlos was the one screaming "press" from midfield, covering every blade of grass like his life depended on it. Soon, even the doubters had to admit. This kid wasn't just talented, he made everyone else better. But just as he was becoming a star, disaster struck, a knee injury. Doctors said he might never play the same. Teammates whispered, "I told you he was reckless." And for the first time, Carlos Alberto looked human. The doctors said 6 months. Carlos Alberto did it in 4. While his knee was still held together by hope and stubbornness, he dragged himself through rehab sessions that would have broken most players. Picture this. 3 a.m. ice baths, weightlifting sessions where his screams scared the janitors, and a personal vendetta against every stationary bike in Rio. His teammates partied. Carlos did squats until he collapsed. Then came the ultimate test, his first match back. The coach wanted to bench him. The fans held their breath. And the opponents? They thought they'd found an easy target. Big mistake. Carlos didn't just play, he annihilated. Every tackle was a statement. Every sprint was a middle finger to the doubters. By halftime, the opposing winger, who'd been talking trash all week, asked to be subbed off. The reason? "I'm not getting murdered today." But here's the twist. That injury changed him. The old Carlos played with rage. The new version, cold, calculated dominance. He started reading games like a chess master, anticipating plays before they happened. And when Botafogo won the Carioca Championship that year, even the veterans had to admit, "This kid's not just our future, he's our leader." Just one problem: greatness has a price. And for Carlos Alberto, the bill was about to come due. Let me ask you something. How do you think a warrior reacts when the kingdom he built decides it doesn't need him anymore? Brazil arrives at the World Cup as two-time defending champions, football's untouchable gods. Carlos Alberto? He's 21 years old, in the form of his life, and ready to conquer the world. But when the squad list drops, his name isn't on it. The reason? Politics. Pure, petty, backroom deals. See, the Brazilian Federation was run by old men who valued experience over talent. They took aging stars, some barely fit to walk, over a hungry young gladiator who'd spent the last year dismantling entire teams. The official excuse? He's too aggressive. The truth? They were scared of his fire. Carlos watched from home as Brazil crashed out in the group stage, humiliated by Hungary, out-muscled by Portugal. And the worst part, he knew he could have changed it. Those slow defenders, he'd have torn them apart. That weak midfield, he'd have organized them with a single glare. But here's where the legend sharpens its teeth. While the football world wrote off Brazil as finished, Carlos Alberto made a silent promise. They will never doubt me again. He spent that summer training like a man possessed. While others rested, he ran stadium steps until he vomited. While others partied, he studied game tape of every top defender in Europe. And when the new season started, oh, it was beautiful. He didn't just play well. He played with a terrifying, surgical precision. Defenders who'd mocked his omission now dreaded facing him. Journalists who'd called him unrefined suddenly praised his tactical genius. With every game, he wasn't just proving he belonged at the top, he was proving Brazil couldn't win without him. And then, 1970 arrived, the World Cup, the greatest team ever assembled, and the moment when Carlos Alberto Torres would either become immortal or be forgotten forever. Mexico. 1970, the World Cup that would redefine football forever. Carlos Alberto arrives with a mission, not just to win, but to humiliate every single person who ever doubted him. But here's the catch. Brazil's manager, Zagallo, doesn't even want him on the team. That's right. The man who would become the greatest right-back in history had to fight just to make the squad. Zagallo thought he was too defensive for Brazil's samba style. The media called him a relic from 1966. Even Pele initially questioned if he fit their attacking vision. So, what does Carlos do? He stages the most ruthless audition in football history. In pre-tournament friendlies, he doesn't just defend, he invents an entirely new role. 1 minute, he's crunching into tackles like a linebacker. The next, he's overlapping like a winger, spraying passes like Pirlo in a time machine. Against Czechoslovakia, he puts on a clinic so dominant that Zagallo has no choice. Carlos Alberto isn't just starting, he's getting the armband. Now the real drama begins. The dressing room is a powder keg of egos. You've got Pele, the king, Jairzinho, the hurricane, Rivellino, the cannon. And in walks 25-year-old Carlos Alberto, tasked with keeping these gods in check. His first speech. Legend says he stared them down and said, "I don't care how famous you are. If you don't track back, I'll break your legs myself." And they loved him for it. Because here's the secret no one tells you about that 1970 team. They weren't just talented. They were terrified of disappointing their captain. When Carlos spoke, even Pele listened. When he demanded extra training, the whole squad stayed. That iconic yellow jersey? It weighed 10 pounds heavier when he wore it. Then came Italy in the final, the moment that would define his legacy. With Brazil leading 3-1 in the 86th minute, Carlos Alberto starts a run from deep in his own half. What happens next isn't just football, it's pure mythology. A 9-pass move involving every outfield player, Pele's casual, no-look hold-up play. And then that finish. Carlos Alberto arriving like a thunderbolt to smash home the greatest team goal ever scored. But here's what they don't show in replays. As the net bulges, Carlos doesn't even smile. He just points to his armband and stares down the Brazilian Federation executives in the stands. The message? You almost left me home. Remember this moment. The world would call that goal perfection. But for Carlos Alberto, it was just the beginning of a war. The world saw the trophy lift, the parades, the immortal highlights. What they didn't see, the knife waiting in Carlos Alberto's back. You'd think conquering the world would earn respect. Instead, it made him dangerous. Brazil's football bosses had a problem. Carlos was too smart, too outspoken, too willing to call out their corruption to the media. So they did what cowards do. They froze him out. Suddenly, minor injuries kept him off the national team. New tactical systems didn't include his position. Meanwhile, Brazil's results collapsed without their captain. But Carlos? He was busy starting a revolution in New York, the NASL. Pele had signed for the Cosmos as a retirement cash grab. Carlos Alberto? He went to war. While others treated America as a vacation, he trained like it was the World Cup final, dragging hungover teammates through drills at gunpoint intensity. His first season, they won the title. His second, they smashed attendance records. This wasn't just playing, it was a statement. My standards don't drop because the stage got smaller. Back in Brazil, the Federation panicked. Their discarded captain was becoming more legendary abroad, so they tried to lure him back for the 1978 World Cup. His response? A smirk and, "I don't play for clowns." The fallout was nuclear. Brazil crashed out in the second round. Their defense, once Carlos's fortress, conceded like a broken dam. Meanwhile, in New York, he engineered back-to-back championships, proving his 1970 brilliance was no fluke. Every trophy was another middle finger to the suits who'd betrayed him. But the greatest revenge? Time. Years later, when Brazil's federation begged him to coach their struggling national team, Carlos agreed on one condition: total control. No interference, no politics, just football. And for one glorious era, the country remembered what real leadership looked like. Yet even kings have their kryptonite, and Carlos Alberto's greatest battle wasn't on the pitch, it was in a hospital room, a hospital bed in Rio. The man who once terrorized defenders now lies staring at a heart monitor, listening to doctors say the words no warrior ever wants to hear. You'll never run again. The diagnosis? Aortic aneurysm, the same condition that had killed his father. The surgery? So dangerous they gave him 50-50 odds. Here's what they didn't account for. Carlos Alberto Torres didn't believe in odds. As they prepped him for the operation, his last words to the surgeons weren't, "Save me." They were, "Hurry up, I've got work to do." 12 hours later, when he woke up with a chest full of stitches and a heartbeat weaker than a penalty appeal, the first thing he asked wasn't about pain or recovery. It was, "When can I train?" The doctors were horrified. This wasn't some sprained ankle. They'd literally rebuilt his heart. But Carlos? He treated rehab like it was the 1970 final all over again. While other patients took weeks to sit up, he was doing chair squats by day 3. When they said maybe light walking in 6 months, he was doing resistance band workouts in his hospital room by week 2. But here's the brutal truth no highlight reel shows. For the first time in his life, his body was losing. The man who once ran 90 minutes at full throttle now got winded climbing stairs. The voice that used to boom across stadiums now tired after short conversations. And worst of all, football moved on without him. Young fans called him that old guy from the black and white videos. Modern players barely knew his name. The sport he'd helped define now worshipped new idols, ones who'd never had to fight through the dirt and blood and betrayal of his era. Yet in typical Carlos fashion, he found a way to win anyway. He became the storyteller, the keeper of flames. On Brazilian TV, his analysis was so sharp it made current defenders look like schoolboys. When Neymar's generation parted, Carlos was the ghost of standards past, growling, "In my day, we'd have eaten you alive." And bit by bit, something remarkable happened. The world remembered. When FIFA named that 1970 team goal the greatest in World Cup history, it wasn't just about the play. It was about the man who finished it, the captain, the fighter, the living proof that some legends don't fade. They burn too bright to disappear. But immortality has a price, and the bill came due on a Tuesday morning no one saw coming. October 25th, 2016. A quiet morning in Rio. The news breaks like a thunderclap. Carlos Alberto Torres, dead at 72. The tributes pour in, from Pele calling him "my greatest captain," to modern defenders tweeting grainy clips of his tackles. But here's what cuts deeper. The stories they don't tell. Like how in his final years he'd host barbecues for struggling young players, grilling meat with one hand and drilling them on positioning with the other. Or how he secretly funded physio treatments for retired players the Federation had forgotten. The man who played with fury loved fiercely. He just hated showing it. The funeral was a who's who of football royalty, but the most telling moment came when an old teammate revealed Carlos's last request. "Bury me in my 1970 jersey, the armband side up." Even in death, he was making a statement. Yet here's the tragedy. Today's kids know more about TikTok challenges than his career. They'll watch that 1970 goal without realizing it wasn't just skill. It was revenge carved into history. That every inch of that run was fueled by years of being told you're not good enough. But legends don't die. Not really. You see Carlos Alberto every time a fullback charges forward like a winger, every time a captain drags his team through sheer will, every time an underdog stares down impossible odds and thinks, "Watch me." The man is gone. The mentality? That's forever. So next time you see a defender score some tap-in and celebrate like they invented football, do me a favor. Pull up Carlos's 1970 goal. Watch the way he demolishes that finish. And remember, real greatness isn't about flash. It's about leaving scars. Obrigado, capitão. Let's settle this right now. Carlos Alberto Torres didn't just play football. He rewrote the DNA of the modern game. And if you don't believe me, look at any top team today. That attacking fullback bombing forward. That's his innovation. The hybrid defender, midfielder, playmaker. His blueprint. The captain who leads by volcanic intensity rather than empty speeches. His standard. But here's what nobody talks about. How close we came to never seeing this revolution. Rewind to 1968. Brazilian coaches were still obsessed with the stay-back fullback, basically glorified traffic cones in boots. When 23-year-old Carlos started making those kamikaze runs for Santos, purists called it heresy. Newspaper columns mocked Torres' folly. Even his own manager sometimes benched him for defensive negligence. Then came the moment that changed football history. May 1970. Brazil versus England in the World Cup group stage. Carlos spends the first half playing properly, staying deep, marking rigidly. Result: 0-0 snooze fest. At half-time, he looks manager Zagallo dead in the eye and says, "Let me off the leash, or we lose." What happens next is like watching Einstein scribble E=mc squared on a napkin. Carlos transforms into a one-man tactical revolution. He's everywhere, dispossessing Bobby Charlton 1 minute, crossing to Pele the next, even taking free kicks. England's defence collapses under the chaos. Brazil wins 1-0. But the real victory, the birth of the complete fullback. Fast forward 50 years, the average top-flight fullback now runs 11 kilometers per game, up from 7 kilometers in 1970. They average 60-plus touches, up from 30. Why? Because Carlos proved the position could be more. He didn't just expand the role, he'd detonated its limitations. Yet for all his influence, modern players often miss the point. They emulate his attacking flair, but forget his defensive fury. Prime Carlos could have marked 2 wingers simultaneously while organizing the backline and planning his next overlap. Today's attacking fullbacks get exposed defensively and shrug. That's not evolution, it's amputation of his legacy. The ultimate irony. The man who modernized defending is now remembered mostly for that goal, when in truth his greatest masterpiece was the 90-minute symphony of controlled violence that came before the highlight reel moment. Which raises the uncomfortable question: if Carlos Alberto played today, would social media even understand his greatness? Picture this. 25-year-old Carlos Alberto Torres time warps into 2024. Not the grainy highlight version, the real, snarling, obsessively competitive animal who bled for every inch of grass. He lasts exactly 37 minutes before getting cancelled. First training session. He demolishes some 100 million winger with a tackle that sounds like a gunshot. Social media erupts. Too aggressive. The analytics department panics. His expected shithousery per 90 is off the charts, and when he drags teammates into extra film study at midnight. Problematic workaholic culture. This isn't just hypothetical, it's happening right now. We've created a football world that worships metrics over mentality, where XG gets more respect than actual grit. Watch any big match today. Fullbacks overlap like robots, terrified to make the game-changing tackle Carlos trademarked. Why? Because modern coaching manuals outlaw reckless defending, which was literally his superpower. But here's the twist. The numbers prove we need him. Since 2010, goals from open play have dropped 22% in top leagues. Why? Because today's sterile possession game eliminated the chaos Carlos mastered. That iconic 1970 goal. It wouldn't happen now, not because players lack skill, but because they'd pass backward at the first sign of pressure. The man who scored the most celebrated team goal in history would today be told, "Don't risk the forward run, maintain shape." Yet buried in the data lies the ultimate vindication. Teams with aggressive fullbacks win 34% more duels, Opta. High-pressing defenders create 2.3 times more counterattacks, Y-Scout. Captains who demand, not ask, boost squad output by 19%, Harvard Sports Study. In other words, Carlos Alberto was right. The tragedy? We've sanitized the very qualities that made him immortal. The solution? Maybe it's time to stop modernizing football and start relearning it from the ghosts we left behind, which leaves one final question. What if the greatest captain football ever knew was actually ahead of his time? We're at a crossroads. Football has never been richer, faster, or more technical, yet something primal is missing. That unshakable certainty that when the lights are brightest, real leaders don't just show up, they take over. Enter Carlos Alberto's ghost, not the sanitized legend from documentaries, the real one. The one who played like his boots were on fire and the only extinguisher was victory. The one who treated armbands not as accessories, but as blood-stained battle standards. Here's the uncomfortable truth. 99% of the current captains couldn't have survived one 1970 training session with him. Not because they lack skill, but because we've systemically eliminated the conditions that forge true leadership. The accountability drought. When was the last time you saw a captain bench his own teammate mid-game for laziness? Carlos did, in a World Cup warm-up. Today, players get subbed for poor performance and post work-in-progress Instagram stories. The intensity gap modern players cover more ground than ever, yet the emotional distance between their best and worst is paper-thin. Carlos didn't have levels, he had war mode. That 1970 final, his resting heart rate was 54. During the match. The legacy black hole. Ask today's stars about football history and you will get, "I don't watch old games." Carlos studied 1950s defensive tapes like they were holy texts. His genius wasn't innate. It was stolen from every warrior who came before him. But here's the hope. The cycle is turning. Pep Guardiola's fullback experiments, shadows of Carlos's blueprint, Arsenal's no friendlies training policy, a whisper of his merciless standards, that viral clip of a youth coach making players redo celebrations until they track back. That's pure Torres energy. The revolution won't come from tactics or technology, but from resurrecting the soul he embedded in the game. Not the tackles, not the goals, the uncompromising belief that excellence isn't a highlight reel, it's a 90-minute religion. So here's my challenge to you. Next time you watch football, don't just look for Carlos Alberto's ghost in overlapping runs or captain's armbands. Look for him in the player who stays late to fix weaknesses instead of filming challenges, in the teenager who chooses grit over TikTok fame, in the leader who cares more about legacy than likes. They're out there. And when they emerge, football will remember what it means to truly burn.